Well, good morning, and welcome back to Nazareth. Yesterday we introduced the narrative from the Gospel of Luke of Jesus being found in a temple when he was 12 years old. And yesterday we asked the question, what does the finding in the temple tell us about the Holy Family? And today we want to ask the question, what does the finding in the temple tell us about Jesus as a child when he's 12? Pope Benedict XVI, in his great book, Jesus of Nazareth, The Infancy Narratives, tells us much about the significance of what the finding in the temple tells us about Jesus. And I have the full quote right there for you on the blog, and just kind of gleaning some of the wisdom from the Holy Father. He does a great job of reminding us that, when you look at the life of Jesus, when you look at the way that some people portray Jesus, sometimes the emphasis is placed exclusively on what we would call the more radical aspects of Jesus' challenge to false piety. Oftentimes Jesus is presented almost as a liberal or a revolutionary. And it is true that in his mission as the Son of God, Jesus did introduce a new phase in man's relationship with God, man's relationship with the Father through him. And certainly Jesus opened up a new dimension of our intimacy with God. But none of this is an attack on Israel's piety, the Holy Father says. He says that, Jesus' freedom is not the freedom of a liberal. It's important for us to know that a lot of times liberality tells us that, freedom means you can do whatever you want. And that's not the type of freedom that Jesus is talking about. His freedom is not the freedom of what we would call a liberal. It's the freedom of a son. It's the freedom of a son of God. And thus his freedom really comes from his relationship with God. It's the freedom of a devout person, he says. And what happens is Jesus brings you and I a new freedom. Not the freedom of someone with no obligations or no responsibility, but the freedom of someone so united with God and his will. Somebody who helps mankind, helps others to attain the same freedom, which is that oneness with God. The Holy Father says that Jesus has come not to abolish, but to complete, to bring us into freedom. And it all is rooted in his sonship, his relationship with the Father. And it actually kind of comes right out there when he's 12 years old. In the narrative that we're reading now, you can see his freedom in God the Father manifested in the temple. And that's what the finding in the temple is meant to convey, he says. And again, that quote is on the blog. You can take a look at it, but it's a great quote and it's a great read if you're looking for a great book to read, especially around the Christmas time. Through the narrative of the finding of the temple, what we learn about Jesus and his childhood is this: that Jesus, even as a child, was a free person. He was a free boy. He was a free man, even from his childhood. Jesus was raised in a home where the Father, God the Father, was the most important person in the home. Certainly Jesus as the Son of God is there. But Mary and Joseph have done a great job as parents of reminding Jesus that God the Father is the center of their home. Mary and Joseph certainly have sought the Father's will every step of their way in their own lives, and they would have created a home where Jesus was free to be who he was, and that's the Son of God. And Jesus' longing for the Father's will was mirrored by his parents and their desire for the Father's will. And you can imagine that Joseph and Mary raised Jesus to know that real freedom is living in the Father, living in God. And I think it's important for us to peer into our attitude towards freedom. Many of us grew up defining freedom as an option rather than a disposition. For example, I can be free to choose whatever I want, and the exterior options are more numerous, and there are no restrictions externally that would prevent me from choosing option A or option B, or more importantly, I can be free to choose whatever I want. The exterior, the external options are still as numerous. However, there are no restrictions interiorly that would prevent me from choosing the very thing I long for. Many of us define freedom as an external reality. We define it by options. But in reality, freedom is an interior disposition. It's not about the exterior. It's about the interior disposition where I am interiorly uninhibited to be who I am, which is only defined by who God made me to be. So in the end, how I define freedom is almost dependent upon how I define happiness. If I think happiness comes from things, then I want to be free to choose the things that I want to do, or the things that I want to buy, or the things that I want to make me happy. However, if I think that happiness comes from God, then I want to be free of anything that would prevent me from being with God. So it's important to ask yourself how you feel about freedom. How do you define it? What's your attitude towards freedom? And in addition, I think it's important for us to ask ourselves about happiness, because it's relation to our disposition toward freedom. How do you define happiness? And where do you seek happiness? Where does it come from? In other words, do you want to be free to, or do you want to be free from? Do you want to be free to do X, Y, Z, or do you want to be free from the things inside? So I would encourage you to spend some time with the Holy Family today and ask them about freedom, real freedom. And maybe as you pray today, maybe enter into maybe the following prayer. Certainly Jesus and Joseph and Mary would have had a single-hearted desire for the Father, and the Psalms would have been a central part of the prayer of the Holy Family. So maybe pray today with Psalm 63 and Psalm 37. They both speak of a single-hearted love for God. Read Psalm 63. The link is right there on the website. And then read Psalm 37, verses 1 to 7. And I want you to read it a couple times again. Get familiar with the text. Pay attention to what word or phrase tugs at your heart. Pay attention to your thoughts, feelings, and desires as you slowly read. And then with that as a background, just kind of close your eyes and enter into, with your imaginative prayer, your spiritual senses, enter into the scene of Luke chapter 2, verses 46, which is the finding in the temple. And just be with Jesus. Like, just notice him. Be there in the scene. Notice his freedom. And he looks at you, and he asks you today, are you free? And he asks you, do you want to be free to, or do you want to be free from? What do you tell him? Jesus, we desire to know you in a deeply personal way. Help us to grow in our relationship with you by growing in freedom. God bless you.